Well, in this episode of Newt's World, Domestic Causes of American Wars, Economic and Political Triggers, offers a unique and critical take on the causes of major American wars throughout its history. Unlike most histories that designate foreign threats as casus belli, this work examines their important underlying economic triggers, reaching the striking conclusion that many were unnecessary for national security, nor were they as heroic in upholding American values as commonly concluded. Further, conventional histories often dwell on the positive outcomes of those wars rather than on their much more important domestic ill effects, the erosion of the American founders' Constitution and of the civil liberties and constitutional checks and balances therein, while enabling the rise of an imperial presidency. In his new book, Ivan Eland addresses those often buried domestic causes and effects, in particular, how American election cycles often affect U.S. entry into wars and how economic motives incentivize war. So I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, who has a fascinating thesis, Ivan Eland. He is a senior fellow and director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. Ivan, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Thanks for having me on. It's really a great honor.
So, first of all, tell us a little bit about the Independent Institute and the work that you're doing there.
Well, I run the Center for Peace and Liberty. It's sort of a libertarian think tank, libertarian-esque oriented, and we explore the roots of big government. And of course, big government has been caused not only in the United States, but in other countries by warfare first and foremost. Now, there are other causes, of course, but a lot of our programs, even if they're not defense related, for instance, our healthcare system came during World War II. And so you can either like the system or hate the system, but its derivation was that daylight savings time came originally in World War I, and then another bout of it was in the early 70s with the oil crisis. These types of things originated in war, and so big government naturally balloons with defense spending and military spending during warfare, but also war drags erosion of civil liberties, that is government intervention into speech and assembly and that sort of thing. And then also economically, we saw price controls in both World War I and World War II. And these are domestic effects which are not very beneficial to the economy in the long run at all.
What drew you into this particular study?
We always focus in histories, we'll always focus on the foreign aspects because most of our wars are foreign wars nowadays. And even back then, we've only had really two domestic wars, the Civil War, and then the wars against the Indians, if you want to call that one war. So most of our wars, we focus on the foreign aspects of it, whereas there are domestic causes and domestic effects, which are really understudied, so to speak. So that's why I wrote this book. I'm not saying that all wars are caused only by domestic factors, but I think the domestic factors have been ignored or just not studied enough. And also the domestic outcomes are very important. Erosion of civil liberties, erosion of the checks and balances, excessive growth of the presidency. These types of things are the outcomes of domestic outcomes of foreign wars.
You warned right after the terrible attacks of October 7th that Israel would regret overreacting. 2 years later, do you think that events have confirmed or challenged that prediction?
Well, I do think they're reaping a lot of international opprobrium for this. If their purpose is to take over Gaza, then that's what they'll do. But I think they're being drawn into a quagmire if they do that. And I think the Israeli military is definitely against that. And I think they proved their point that they retaliated for the October 7th attacks, which were heinous and which, of course, required some response. But I think that it should have been more measured than it was. And I think they're only going to reap a long-term program because they're really creating hatred in the Gazans, which I think will, even if you get rid of Hamas, the idea that they have to retaliate for Israel's overkill, in my opinion, of Gaza. And I think even the Israeli military has leaked out that their military objectives were satisfied a year ago. And so this is one area. I know we're not discussing Israeli domestic politics, but I think this is one area where domestic factors after that year have taken over. And that's Netanyahu's standing within Israel and within his government.
I mean, that would be a fascinating place to take your thesis and look at the impact of Israeli domestic behavior on the way in which they've waged war. Now, when you look at President Trump, some historians argue that he is recreating a 19th century style international order, complete with spheres of influence, territorial expansion, and trade protectionism. Do you think that's accurate?
Well, he certainly is a protectionist in the trade area. In his foreign policy area, I have supported some of what Trump has done, particularly with the Europeans, in that they've always been promising to spend more on defense and then just never got around to it. I think that the two things have awakened them a bit, at least. That is the Ukraine war, Putin invading Ukraine, and the other one is Donald Trump. And he's been very adamant that he wants them to do 5%. If he ends the war as he's trying to, whether that promise will go by the way when the threat is reduced or at least goes under the covers again is one thing. But I think his solution for supporting Ukraine is the right one. I think we should back off from direct support, and he can do the same thing by selling the weapons that Ukraine needs from the U.S. through the Europeans, sell them to them, and the Europeans could get them to the Ukrainians. And I think that's the way to go. So I think he's right on that particular issue. And in general, I think he's probably less interventionist, although he occasionally talks about taking military action against Panama and Greenland, which I think would be very counterproductive. But he does, in the sense, he doesn't mask imperialism with rhetoric. He just says it. So we'll have to see what his record is. I think he's taken military action a couple of times against Iran in both of his terms. But he hasn't run wild with wars like the Clinton administration did with intervening for dubious reasons in the developing world.
When you think about 19th century international relations, you wrote an article that Trump can create a concert of great powers, which in some ways reminded me of Vienna and the concert after the defeat of Napoleon. What did you have in mind how that would work?
I think that we're approaching a multipolar world, and our debt is so huge that I think we're going to have to cut spending eventually in the military and in domestic programs to get this under control. It's $37 trillion now, and it's going to go up some more according to the projections. So we're in a different world now than the end of World War II when we dominated the world. And even during the bipolar Cold War, we've really got to have a manageable security posture for the multipolar world. And we have rising centers of power like India that weren't there before. And of course, Germany and Japan are economic powers, and China is both an economic power and a budding military power as well. The Russians now, they're a bit debilitated by this war. But I think Roosevelt, before he went on his UN binge at the end of his presidency, his initial thinking of what would happen after World War II was it would be sort of a concert of powers to manage things. But of course, he never really sold that to the American public, and Truman came in and had a different idea. But my current vision is sort of a version of his 4 policemen, except I think there would probably have to be 5 or 6 policemen or more on the Security Council if you count the economic powers as well. But each power would sort of police its own area. And, the U.S. can't guarantee that the other powers are going to be benevolent, but I think we should have learned by Hoover and Roosevelt's good neighbor policy in the 1930s really paid off because those countries were much more receptive to anti-U.S., anti-Hitler, the need for measures that, against Hitler's. My mother used to say you get more with sugar than vinegar. Of course, no one told Putin that, but the question with Ukraine is which sphere of influence do they want to be in? And of course, the Ukrainians want to be in the EU. Russians don't want them in that, and they don't want them to be in NATO. So you'd have boundary disputes, but if you could get everybody to agree on the spheres of influence, you could go back to a realist sort of thing. Now, of course, there would still be issues that you need to go to the UN for, that cross national borders, drug trafficking, people trafficking, etc. But I think that letting the powers police their own regions would be a start. That seems to be the only feasible alternative. Everyone always criticizes intervention here or there, but they don't come up with an alternative strategic vision of what the U.S. should do. We're always kind of ad hoc. We get dragged back into the Middle East every time we try to pivot to Asia to counter China. We're easily distracted by the latest dust-up, and I think we could probably do a little bit more strategic thinking. My proposal is not foolproof. It's a start on thinking about how we would be able to do this in a more fiscally constrained way, which I think of that will eventually come one way or the other.
To what extent is it in our interest to stop Putin from taking over all of Ukraine, and to what extent is that in fact not a primary American interest?
Well, I would say it doesn't really affect a primary American interest. I mean, we dealt with Ukraine as part of the Soviet Union, and of course, Ukraine is more strategic to Russia than anything else. But of course, the policing of international boundaries and not changing them by force is a principle that we've had in the past, which we've only followed ourselves erratically over our history. But certainly that's been a principle that the U.S. has followed more recently. So that's an issue. But you're correct. I don't think Ukraine is a vital interest to the U.S. I mean, the press and every other place has made it as such. And I also think in the long term, we should have a better relationship with Russia. But it's hard to do when we have this current situation going on. I'm hoping that Trump can solve the issue. It would be good. And if we could rehabilitate relations with Russia, we don't have to like Putin and the way he governs his country. I'm sort of a realist. That's my basis for this concept. I would say that Trump does have some possibility here of solving the crisis if he plays his cards right.
Do you worry at all that if Putin were to win all of Ukraine, that in fact, after taking a pause to rebuild his forces, that would put Poland or Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia at some risk?
Well, if NATO doesn't mean anything, it would. But I think we've always expanded NATO and pledged to defend these countries. So I think those countries are a bit different than Ukraine, since Ukraine is not in there. And Ukraine is more traditionally in the Russian sphere of influence. And it's very important culturally as well as economically to Russia. I think we can make that argument ad nauseum as far as falling dominoes. It's sort of a modern version of that. So first of all, Putin may learn from this as well, because to me, he lost the war at the beginning because he thought it was going to be waltz in there and take over Ukraine and make it a satellite country like Belarus. The Ukrainians have a vote and they voted no. So I think he should have learned some lesson. And also his military has been torn apart by this. He's lost 250,000. The figure's hard to estimate accurately, but he's lost more than the Ukrainians have. And his military performed really awfully. So at least as long as he's a ruler there, I don't think his military is going to be in very good shape, because in an authoritarian situation, no one likes to tell the boss that our military, we're having big problems here. And there's no independent media to discover this. And I think, frankly, Xi Jinping in China should be a little bit nervous about what his military, they can do goose steps and stuff. And they're probably more capable than the Russian military, but nobody knows how they'll react. They haven't been at war in 70 years. So I guess that's a long answer to your question, but I think we also have to make the Europeans do more. Some of the bigger European countries need to start supporting Poland and the Lithuanians and the other Baltic states that are on the front lines there. We shouldn't have to do it all. And Russia is a fraction of the EU GDP. And so the Europeans are very wealthy and they can do not only more in Ukraine, but more for Poland and the rest of the people that are exposed.
You described the notion that for the first 100 years or so, most of our major wars were either to pursue commerce or to acquire new territory. And then, after World War II, we really shifted to maintaining a global hegemony and making the United States dominant, using our weight both economically and militarily. Do you think it was that big and that decisive? And I notice you don't quite include World War I in the transition.
Well, World War I, the States certainly penetrated the economy, and you had the budding military. But for World War II was the first war that we really had a dedicated defense industry, because in all the other wars, we had civilian factories and they would make tanks, they would make cannon or whatever for the war, and then they would go back to civilian production when the war was over. And that prevented a military industrial complex from forming. In other words, we need lots of military spending during the peacetime to keep our industries for the next war. Well, in World War II, it was such a massive war, even compared to World War I, that the defense industries grew from cities to suburbs to actual semi-rural areas. So, in a lot of these semi-rural areas and suburban or ex-urban places, their economy really didn't have much left after the war was over, whereas the cities were more versatile and they adjusted. So, a lot of these industries lobbied for continued defense spending. And during the Korean War, after the World War II, this military-industrial complex really became permanent. And so did, of course, a larger military. That was the first time we had a large peacetime military in history, was after 1953. So it's been a fairly recent phenomenon. And now we have a situation where our defense industry, most of it doesn't make any civilian items. So it's dependent on continued weapons production. I'm for requiring more competition at the subcontract level so that the military industrial base isn't quite so dependent on just defense contracts. A lot of the computer stuff and that sort of stuff and artificial intelligence, that's one area where they could reduce its specifications and allow more competition so that we don't have that. It's not going to end the military industrial complex overnight, but it would certainly help. And the military industry is not very competitive. Even when they compete contracts, they're more allocated than competitive in many cases.
One of our great problems now in defense spending is that we have basically a government giant private bureaucracy partnership, which guarantees that you don't get competition, you don't get innovation, and all too often the companies invest more in lobbyists than they do in engineers. One of the points you've made that's kind of interesting to play with is the notion that had the North decided to buy out slavery, it would have been dramatically less expensive than fighting the Civil War. Do you really think there were circumstances where Southern culture would have tolerated that kind of emancipation?
Well, that's a good question. And I don't definitively say that. I think, but they didn't try it. And Abraham Lincoln was for it in the 1840s when he was a congressman. But then when it came time for the secession, he really wasn't, because he really wasn't trying to free the slaves right away. His main goal and his sole goal was to reunite the Union by force. And so after a while, in the middle of the war, he started asking the border states that were still in the unions that had slaves if they would do that. And they really weren't that interested. And of course, the Southerners weren't interested after the fighting started. But it was never tried before the war. And I think most major countries got rid of slavery by compensated emancipation or gradual emancipation. And my view is that Lincoln, he made the classic mistake of thinking the war was going to be short and over when the Union Army went into the South and everyone was awestruck by the rabble was awestruck by the incoming forces or whatever. But of course, wars never turn out that way, and the enemy does have a vote. And the war caused so much bitterness that you had sort of a neo-slavery system. Once the Democrats took over the Southern governments again, you had neo-slavery for another 100 years until the civil rights movement. I'm not sure that all that bitterness that was caused by the Civil War really helped out African Americans that much at all. And of course, a lot of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were all really eroded in one way or another in the aftermath. So I think it would have been better to try that. But of course, Lincoln, he actually supported a different 13th Amendment before the one we got in his first inaugural, which would have made slavery permanent in the southern states. So his goal at the beginning of the war was not to free slaves. And in fact, he really didn't free that many slaves at the Emancipation Proclamation because he freed them in only areas that the Confederate forces occupied, not the Union forces. So that was sort of a bizarre twist. So the Congress really freed the slaves with the 13th Amendment when it was passed. And of course, Lincoln didn't have anything to do with that just by the nature of constitutional amendments.
When you look at these different things, I notice also that you suggest that we could have avoided going into World War I, and there was actually economic interest rather than national security that was a driving factor. Can you explain that?
Well, what happened was we came into the war in 1917, but the war had started long before in 1914, and we had a lot of trade and loans with the Allies, but almost none with the Germans. And the British put on a hunger blockade to try to starve Germany into submission. And Woodrow Wilson really didn't have too much of a problem with that. But he did have a problem with the German version of that, which wasn't as efficient as the British Navy, which was the top dog naval power in the world. Then the Germans were forced to do a sea denial with U-boats. And that's not as efficient as a blockade with your entire navy around the Baltic area. So Wilson was hardly neutral. We had a neutral policy, which was neutral in name only, really. And he objected to Americans being unsafe when they traveled on belligerent ships containing arms shipments in a war zone around Britain, France, and Italy. So this was quite a deal. And William Jennings Bryan, his Secretary of State, resigned because he said, well, we're not neutral here and you're expecting way too much for this. And the Congress tried to pass a law saying that Americans couldn't travel on belligerent ships. And they did that in the 1930s when the Nazis were rising in Germany and Italy and Japan were both active. And we were moving toward World War II. They passed neutrality acts to do exactly that. And they could have done so at the time, but Wilson had these ideas that our people should be safe even under those extreme circumstances. So he was kind of holding the Germans to a pretty high standard. We sort of look at World War I, which I think most historians would regard as more important than World War II since it set the basis for World War II. But we kind of see World War I only through World War II. Well, the Germans have always been evil, but Hitler was certainly a much bigger threat to the U.S. than the Kaiser was. And the Kaiser really didn't even want to be in the war, and none of the countries wanted to be in that war, but they were dragged into it by alliances that they may have regretted after the war started. But I think Neil Ferguson, who's a conservative historian, really says that the British lost their empire in World War I by getting involved in it. He said they didn't need to. And he said by that argument, the U.S. didn't need to get into it either. And I agreed with that. I debated him one time and he goes, we have a lot more in common than I thought we did. So I think the U.S. could have stayed out of that war, even if Britain got into it. But certainly if Britain hadn't been into it, we wouldn't have been into it because we had a recession right before the war started. And Wilson, all these war orders, weapons, and we are also feeding Europe because of the war. They couldn't grow as many crops. And so therefore, our economy began to depend on their war, and then it became our war.
The British ignored their obligation under the 1830 treaty with Belgium and just stayed out of the war. My guess is that World War I would have lasted about 6 to 8 months, that the Germans would have beaten the French and then pivoted and beaten the Russians and created a very German-centered European sort of world order.
Right, but of course the British still had their fleet. So yes, Germany might have won if we hadn't come to the English and French. One of the big things is we always herald the effect of the U.S. soldiers on the front, but I think when we got into the war, that triggered a whole bunch of loans, because if the Germans had known that the British and French were almost bankrupt, in the war in 1918, they wouldn't have done those wasted a lot of men on their offensives that failed. They could have just retreated and been defensive and probably won the war that way as well if the U.S. hadn't entered.
Without the U.S., I suspect, in the end, the British and the French lose. If we had stayed out, and I think certainly in 1914, if Britain had stayed out, I think it's very clear that the Germans would have won the war pretty fast.
Yes, the British hadn't been in, yes.
I really want to thank you for joining us. You look at things differently. You ask a whole different set of questions. You force us to challenge the assumed version of history and ask, were there alternative ways to do things? And I think all that's really, really valuable. And I think that your new book, Domestic Causes of American Wars, Economic and Political Triggers, it's available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. And I want our listeners to know that they can find more about the work you're doing at the Independent Institute by visiting your website at independent.org, and they're going to find themselves really asking new questions and thinking new thoughts by following your work. So I really want to thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thank you to my guest, Ivan Eland. You can get a link to buy his new book, Domestic Causes of American Wars, Economic and Political Triggers, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.